Does the government work for us, or do we work for the government? Can the debt ceiling crisis be solved through the bitter politics of compromise, or can political courage save the day? Tonight, debt and compromise and the Federal Reserve. The problem, America, is a simple one, but the solution requires political courage. Since the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, the federal government has always spent more money than it has collected in taxes. The additional money has been provided by borrowing. When the borrowed money has become due, the government has simply borrowed more money, often at higher interest rates, and used the newly borrowed money to pay back the lenders who came calling. Any high school student capable of understanding basic math knows that this simply cannot last. At some point, the debt is so great that the interest payments become unbearable. That point is today. Today, the debt that the federal government owes, that your federal government owes, is $14.3 trillion. And the annual interest payments on that debt are about $440 billion. Where does the government get that $440 billion? It borrows it. The government is so addicted to debt that it has become the source for about 40% of all the bills the federal government pays. In some months, the feds actually borrow more money than they collect in taxes. And as we know, it saves nothing. Every dollar it can get its hands on, it spends. To make this even less transparent, the government has created its own bank and authorized that bank to print cash and then lend that printed cash to the government. This is the functional equivalent of counterfeiting. And anyone who thinks that this can continue without adverse consequences is willfully ignorant of basic economics. Think about it. If printing cash produced prosperity, then we'd all be rich. Instead, the government's now 100-year-old failed experiment of printing cash has burdened each person in America with a debt of over $44,000. In the last 2 years, the government's bank that counterfeits all this cash, the Federal Reserve, has done so to the tune of nearly $1.6 trillion. This $1.6 trillion is included in the $14.3 trillion national debt that the federal government is obligated to pay. But wait a minute. If the federal government owes the Federal Reserve $1.6 trillion, doesn't that mean that the government, in a sense, owes $1.6 trillion to itself? This is an issue that the Fed will never want to confront. Is the Federal Reserve a government institution, or is it a private bank? One way to burst that bubble and answer that question would be for the federal government simply to cancel its obligations to the Federal Reserve. In fact, Texas Republican Congressman Ron Paul suggested just last week that the federal government simply default on its payments to the Federal Reserve. No one would lose a nickel if we owe the money to ourselves. If the government were to wipe out its debt to the Federal Reserve, then investors might actually feel confident that the government could meet its legitimate obligations to legitimate lenders, rather than to its own bank that counterfeits its own cash. What would the Fed do if the government stopped paying it for its counterfeit cash? It would claim that it is a private bank. It would deny that it is a government institution. It would sue the federal government. And ultimately, the Supreme Court would decide if this 100-year-old printing press experiment is constitutional or moral in the first place. And then we will see that the emperor has had no clothes. Texas Congressman Louis Gohmert offered a flattering insight into Washington last week when he remarked that by Freedom Watch addressing this issue with conservatives and libertarians in Congress, the show has been strengthening the backbones of those on Capitol Hill who've become wobbly. Republicans must resist the fear-mongering, the Obama administration's shills and its lies and its attempts to cajole them into borrowing more money. Some establishment GOP members are openly signaling their willingness for a compromise with the vague reference to the idea that there must be significant cuts in spending. What they don't tell you is that significant cuts means reductions in increases in spending, not cuts in actual spending. It's a trick. Don't be fooled. History will judge the Republicans in Congress by the actions they take in the next few weeks. This may be the last best hope to rein in a monster federal government by forcing it to live within its means. If Republicans muster the courage to do this, if they stop the federal government from borrowing now, the voters will reward them with victory, and the economy will reward all of us with prosperity. On the other hand, if the Republicans let the government continue its 100-year failing experiment, they will be relegated to the dustbin of history, which